So, what does it mean to be relevant? And how can we know whether or not we're truly being relevant to a situation that we're finding ourselves in? Welcome to the Architecting Through Life podcast, where we dig into principles for building ourselves up as individuals while navigating the realities of this thing called life. The podcast is dedicated to young adults and anyone with the deep hunger to grow in their journey of being all that they were created to be. My name is Simon Gubeni, and with each episode I'll be discussing thoughts and insights drawn from life, from the Bible, from unique experiences, as well as from other great minds and mentors. Thanks for joining me on this journey, and I do hope that you'll enjoy today's episode. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Architecting Through Life podcast. Thanks so much for listening in. Today I want to get into a discussion on this idea of being relevant, or of relevance. I was having a conversation the other day with some friends, and the conversation was about how as individuals we can be a source of good or make an impact in society. And the idea of relevance came up, and it seemed in the conversation that we're having that we all seem to agree on this idea that it's important that in our efforts as individuals and maybe even as different institutions that we represent, in our efforts to try and be a source of good or make a positive impact to the world around us, to always try to do so in a way that's relevant, right? That's relevant, and that's what I want to get into, right? To perhaps add a thought that's worth considering on this idea of what it means to be relevant, or what we mean when we talk about relevance, right? So when you actually look at the word relevance, when we talk about the word relevant, what comes to mind is the idea that being relevant means to be closely related to or connected to something that's currently happening, right? Being appropriate to a situation that's being considered. It's the idea of being in touch with a current situation, right? To be connected in a way that matters. For example, if you're telling a story and the things that you're telling about the story, the information that you add to the story is relevant to the story and the point that you're trying to convey. And the story becomes meaningful because of the relevance of the information that you've put in it, right? And even the pieces of the information that you leave out of the story, you leave them out because they are not relevant, right? And it's the idea that something that is relevant because it's necessary to the story that's being told, right? To be relevant to something is to be closely connected to the situation at hand, to be in touch with the matter at hand. And I want to add a perspective towards that, right? On this idea of relevance, that being relevant isn't just being connected to a situation or being related to it, but it's being connected in a way that actually adds value, right? So something can be connected with something, like something can be related to something, a piece of information can be related to a story, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it always brings value to it, right? So if I were to use an example, consider a young lady who might be in matric, that's grade 12, who is looking for advice on trying to understand how to get into university and what to do when you're there in order to do well, right? So this young lady might then go to asking her friend who was in the same class who's also in matric, and then asking him, to give her advice on what to do in order to get into university and to then do well in university. But because they're both in matric and they have relatively similar knowledge and experience, the advice that the friend gives is nothing new to the young lady, right? It's nothing that the young lady hasn't heard before because of the fact that they share a similar level of experience and knowledge, right? So the things that he's bringing to her aren't relevant because the information that she needs must be something that will add value that she might not currently have on hand at the moment, right? So what the friend might be giving her is connected, right? It's related to the experience that she's going through, but it doesn't add any necessarily meaningful value because it's not giving her anything more than what she currently has on hand, right? And that's what I mean when I talk about this idea of relevance being more than just being connected. It's the idea that when we're talking about this idea of relevance, what would be truly relevant in the young lady's story is someone who not only brings the information that's related to the matter at hand, but adds to that the value that will help her actually solve the problem. Right. So if relevance is something that's connected to a situation at hand, truly being relevant is being connected to the situation at hand in a way that actually adds value or brings a benefit to that situation. Right. In the young lady's story, it would be to solve her problem. Right. And the reason this is important to note about relevance is the idea that relevance isn't only then being connected to what's happening. Right. So when we're talking about that, I want to be relevant to my situation, is that you're not just want to be connected to it, but it's possibly related then to being valuable and adding a benefit to the thing that one is connected to, right? So that being relevant isn't just about being connected to something or being related to it, but it's about being related to it while still bringing a unique element of value to it, right? And maybe one can even say that in the opposite way, that to be connected to something while not adding any benefit or unique value to it could otherwise then be say that it's redundant, right? It's redundant, and I'll get into that for a moment, what it means to be redundant, right? So being relevant is being connected to something, being related to it, like the information in a story that's valuable, that's connected to the story. It's connected to the story because it's relevant, right? And that's what makes it relevant. But it's relevant in a way that adds value to the overall meaning of the story, right? And then I said that to be connected with something while not adding benefit or any unique value is what we'd call redundant. So it's maybe to get into this idea of redundant. Redundant isn't the same as irrelevant, right? Irrelevant is when something has no connection or relationship with something. So it's unnecessary in that sense. So if you're telling a story and then adding a piece of information that has nothing to do with the story, it becomes irrelevant, right? Like if I were to tell you a story of Usain Bolt, the world championship record holder for the 100-meter sprint at the Olympics. If I were to tell you the story of how Usain Bolt became the champion, and then in my story I tell you that while he was growing up, his next door neighbor used to love eating cornflakes, that bit of information is not in any way connected to the reality of the story. So in that respect, it's irrelevant, right? Like there's no connection between that and how Bolt broke the world record, right? So that neighbor's breakfast preference as an addition to the story is irrelevant because of the fact that it's not connected in any way, right? So something is irrelevant when it's not connected in any way to the reality of what's going on. Redundancy is different though. Redundancy is when something is connected to the thing, but it's connected in a way that doesn't necessarily bring any real value to it. Like the young lady's friend, he's telling her information that's connected to her situation, but because it's not bringing anything that she doesn't already know, it's not adding any real value. And as an account of that, it's connected, but it's not valuable. And that's what makes it redundant, right? It's not useful. So something is redundant when it's no longer relevant because it doesn't add value to that given situation, right? If you were to ever use the term redundant, for example, in language, if you have ever done English first language in high school, when we learned about this idea of redundancy, it's when you use two words which have the same meaning in the same sentence, right? And because those two words bring the same meaning, one of them becomes redundant, right? So if you were to say that I will meet you at a certain place at 12 midday. 12 midday, the term 12 obviously then means midday, right? So the word 12 becomes redundant there because they're both speaking about the exact same thing, right? So both words, that idea of 12 and midday, both related in the same sentence, are describing the exact same thing, and on account of that, one of them is redundant. And in that situation, 12 becomes redundant because the word midday is more useful, right? 12 can either mean midday or midnight, so midday then clarifies and becomes more useful in that sentence, right? The idea of redundancy, as we're taught in high school English, is when a word is used but doesn't bring any real value, even though it may be connected to that sentence, right? The word redundant is also used in companies as well. So when companies lay people off, they go through retrenchments, and the employees that get laid off are the ones whose roles have become redundant, right? Their roles are no longer useful to the work that's available, right? So there may be two employees that are working for a company, and the work that they're hired for might only need one person to accomplish it. And so because two people are there and they're in a situation that only needs one person to accomplish the work, one of those people then becomes redundant, right? Because they are inappropriate for the job. They're unnecessary, right? They're both there to solve a problem that only needs one individual to solve it. So while they may both have the skills to do it, one of them is redundant because the other one is already there to fulfill that value, right? So with this idea of relevance, then relevance isn't only about being appropriate for something, right, or connected to it. It's also about being connected in a way that actually brings an added value that may be missing. And the reason I say that is because sometimes in the effort to be relevant to a situation, a person can make themselves redundant by trying to be the exact same thing as those who are already in a situation, right? I see this a lot in the South African YouTube network, right? Where you'll find that it can be similar content, makeup, lifestyle, fashion, and a get to know me tag, right? They're definitely related, obviously, to a given market or an audience, but it can become redundant because you have a number of different people doing the exact same thing in the exact same way, right? But that's not to throw shade on anyone who's thinking to start a YouTube channel on makeup tutorials or anything like that. I'm not there. In fact, I hope maybe by the end of this conversation, it might even show how you can have actually much more value than that. But to emphasize the point that sometimes in the effort to become relevant to a situation, we can make ourselves redundant by trying to be exactly the same as those who are already in that given situation, right? By assimilating to what we think we're actually trying to be relevant to. And as a account of that, we make ourselves redundant, right? We make ourselves redundant. So what does relevance then look like in a given scenario? Maybe we could look at it on account of individuals, maybe as businesses and institutions, and also in relationships, what relevance looks like, and something that we all strive for, that we want something that is relevant, right? That's connected to my current situation. So maybe as individuals, what allows us to be relevant in spaces as individuals, in spaces that we find ourselves in, let's say for a workplace, for example, as an employee, what makes you and I relevant in that situation is our knowledge, our experience, our education, right? The competence that we have to solve a given task in that company, right? And that's what makes us connected to the situation. The fact that I have skills which are necessary for the problem that is existing in your company, right? Or in your business or whatever that may be. But on top of that, we also bring with ourselves our unique individual perspectives, right? Our voices, our backgrounds, our experiences, and all of these work together to produce a unique value or benefit that we can bring to the situation that we're connected with, right? Each of us as individuals have a unique value that actually makes us relevant to the situation that we're currently connected with, right? Whether it's in how I apply knowledge, whether it's in how I see things, whether it's in my character, my personality, whether it's our beliefs, our cultural backgrounds, or whatever it may be, that as an individual, we may be relevant by not only being connected to a task with our competence, with our skills, but also with the unique perspective and character that we bring to a place. And that's actually why, if you ever have been in the process of trying to find employment, there's usually a two-step process to it, right? There's the submission of a CV, which shows your competence, right? Your ability to meet that specific task. And then there's also the interview, right? Which is there to evaluate your personality, your character, your unique perspective. And both of those then are saying to the employer that this person is relevant for the task and that they're connected to what we need, but also they bring an added value of their unique perspective, right? And obviously that comes with, as an individual, knowing what unique perspective you bring, right? What is it that makes me unique from another person who might be applying for the same role or task, right? If you are in that position. But I think relevance also then applies in larger settings, such as a company or a business or an institution, right? Being relevant in a way that actually adds value, right? So being connected to a given situation in a way that actually adds value, you know? There's this thing, if you've ever gone through a startup process or a process of ever trying to build a company, there's this thing called a USP, a unique selling proposition, right? Or a unique selling point, which is basically a factor that sets a business apart from its competitors and offers a specific benefit to the customer, right? It's what sets it apart from its competition and offers you and I as customers a unique benefit or value, right? That unique selling proposition. It's what makes it relevant in a way that is valuable, right? And that's usually identified by asking questions like what the customer wants, what value they can bring as you know, the supplier or as the business, and what it is that sets that business apart from its competitors, right? So that's what allows it to then, what I would say, outline its unique selling proposition, its value, its unique selling point that makes it relevant, right? And that's what makes one relevant. So what makes that company relevant to you and I, for example, as customers, is that what they offer is connected to what we want, right? It's related to what we want. And also they can do it well, right? Or at least well enough for them to be paid to do it, right? They can do it better than what you and I could do it. So if I were to use an example of the guy who cuts my hair, his name is Eric. Eric does a phenomenal job, right? He's my barber. He does an awesome job for a relatively decent price, right? The way Eric cuts hair he cuts it better than I can cut hair, right? And because of that, he's related to what I want, but also he brings an added value in the sense that he can cut my hair better than I can cut my hair, right? So if I were to be able to cut my hair the way Eric cuts my hair, Eric would then become redundant, right? Because we're both able to accomplish the same task. And so he then would become redundant because he would not be bringing any added value, right? And also, I like to think of it, maybe on still the discussion of institutions and businesses. I like to think of it when it comes to different institutions which form part of what will make up a stable society, right? So that's the state, enterprise and businesses, NGOs, and even churches as part of a stable society, right? All of those different institutions are connected to the realities of what goes on in society, but they all bring a unique benefit to respond to the different aspects of society, right? So whether it's the physical, whether it's the mental, the economic, educational, the spiritual, the mental, all of those different institutions are responding to a given set of societal conditions, but they're responding to them in a way that adds a unique value. And that's then what makes them relevant, right? And so this idea of relevance is then being relevant is being connected to the reality of what's going on and doing so in a way that produces or brings meaningful value, right? That's at an institutional or business level. And it's also the case with relationships, right? In relationships, relevance may look like connecting with someone who relates to you, to your values, to your experiences, but who also brings a unique something, a unique perspective in themselves that adds to that relationship, right? It's often said that you never want to be in a relationship with someone who's exactly like you, because then they're not bringing anything valuable to the table, right? Now and again, I'll read a post of a lady saying, I don't need a man, either financially or otherwise. I'm independent. I don't need a man or a relationship, and so that's alluding to the idea that a relationship is irrelevant, right? And I imagine that obviously that individual might not need a man in many respects, right? It's probably true that they don't necessarily need a partner. And I'd even actually add that we should avoid being in relationships where the foundation of the relationship is a need for the other person, right? But relevance adds value, not just in terms of a need, right? But relevance can be in adding value by providing an opportunity to become better than what you currently are at the moment, right? So relevance can be a response not only to a need, but it can be a response to an opportunity, right? An opportunity to be better or go further than where you otherwise could be, right? So in relationships, for example, and by the way, I'm no expert at relationships and I don't even claim to be one, but we all are in relationships in some form or fashion, right? But in relationships, the idea of relevance is that a person can be relevant in your life not because you depend on them to fulfill a need, but because you realize that sharing your life with them will then add value for you in the long term, right? It will take you from one level to another, not because you need anything or are dependent on them, but because you realize that you can go further through pairing yourself with other individuals, right? It's one of those we're stronger together than we are apart type of situations, right? And realizing this actually comes with a level of maturity, right? It's like how Stephen Covey, the author of 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, when he describes what he calls the maturity continuum, he describes immaturity as a person who's dependent on others, right? And then he says maturity is when someone is independent on others. And then he takes it a step further and he says a higher level of maturity is when you realize that while you are independent, you can do better by pairing with other people, right? And then he calls that interdependence. That interdependence is a higher level of maturity that realizes that, look, I don't necessarily need other people, but I know that I can do more and go further by pairing myself with other people. And then that's what makes them relevant to you and I, right? And this is also why families are so important. And it applies more so to families, to relationships, not just romantic relationships, but also siblings, right? Parental relationships, extended families, right? You can never be redundant as a member of a family because you're already connected and you also have a unique value to bring, right? Whether or not others may realize it. And so sometimes relevance isn't only in response to a need, but it's also in response to an opportunity, right? That there are some things which don't necessarily need to fill a void, but they help to take you from good to great, right? And that's the idea of relevance. So maybe a recap on relevance. I said relevance is the idea of being connected to something at hand, right? And that not being connected to something at hand then is irrelevant, right? Relevance is to be connected to something and to be connected in such a way that actually adds value or benefit, right? To be connected to a situation in some way that actually adds value or benefit. And then I said to be connected with something, but to not bring any value to it is what we'd otherwise call being redundant, right? Being redundant. So as individuals, as those who want to make an impact to the world around us with our unique gifts, with our unique abilities, with our unique perspectives and cultures and backgrounds and thoughts, all of those are part of the package of the added value that we bring to the world around us. And we do so by also being connected to the realities of the world around us. So that through being connected and being connected in a way that brings added value, we then can truly say that we are relevant and not redundant. That's it for today's episode. Thanks so much for tuning in. Do let me know what your thoughts are on the topic. I'd like to get your thoughts, maybe your perspective. Maybe it can be relevant to myself as well. But otherwise, my name is Simon, and I'm wishing you all the best on your journey of architecting through life. Much love. Thank you for listening to the episode that you've just heard on the Architecting Through Life podcast. If you found it valuable, please kindly do me the favor of sharing it and maybe leaving a comment if you'd like. I'd really like to get your thoughts, any impact that you might feel it may have, and do feel free to share it with someone else so that it can be a benefit to them as well. Thank you so much for your time, and do join us again on the next episode of the Architecting Through Life podcast.